This is CR Change Request, your structural brief for Friday, April 24th, 2026. Today's read is the weekly rundown covering 5 signals that moved this week: tariff refunds, workplace AI training, fair lending enforcement, airline distress, and cannabis reclassification. Let's start with tariffs. This week, the federal tariff refund portal opened following the Supreme Court's decision striking down the emergency global tariffs. The surface read is simple. A legal ruling was issued, and now importers can file for refunds. That is accurate, but it is not the read. Here's what actually moved. A constitutional decision became a liquidity event. The moment a refund portal opens, the policy question is no longer abstract. It becomes cash flow, it becomes pricing strategy, it becomes margin recovery and inventory adjustment across every importer that paid into the system. If you have been watching trade policy as a doctrinal conversation, this is the moment it stopped being doctrine. Think about what that means structurally. The court ruled on the law, the Treasury and Customs system is now ruling on the money. Those are two different instruments of power, and they do not always move in the same direction. So, what should you be watching for? Watch whether those refunds stay with importers, get passed through to consumers, or become the next leverage point in trade negotiations and ongoing litigation. Refund money is rarely neutral. It tends to become the basis for the next argument. The ruling was law. The portal is where the money starts telling the truth. Let's move to Meta. In recent reporting, Meta has been using a mandatory internal tool to track employee activity on work devices in order to train its AI systems. The coverage has framed this largely as a workplace surveillance story, and surveillance is part of it. But that framing misses the architecture. Here is the piece most people miss. Workplace behavior is not only being watched, it is being converted into training data. That is a category shift. Surveillance is about oversight. Training data is about production. When your keystrokes, your workflows, and your decision patterns become inputs into a model, the labor relationship changes shape. You are not only working, you are producing the raw material for the system that will eventually be used to evaluate work itself. If you have been tracking the AI labor conversation, you already know the dominant frame has been replacement, asking which jobs go, which jobs stay, and which jobs get augmented. That frame is incomplete. So, where is this actually heading? The next fight is not only about who keeps their job, it is about who owns the behavioral data generated inside the job. That is a labor question. It is a privacy question. And it is quickly becoming a state policy question as AI regulation picks up at the state house level. Watch for workplace privacy litigation, labor organizing around data rights, and whether large employers in other sectors adopt similar tools quietly. This does not stay inside one company. The next AI labor fight may not be replacement, it may be extraction. Let's turn to fair lending. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau moved this week to step back from disparate impact enforcement under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, while leaving the prohibition on intentional discrimination in place. The headline read is that the agency is narrowing its scope. The structural read is more consequential. Disparate impact is the legal standard that asks whether a policy produces unequal outcomes regardless of intent. When that standard recedes, the burden of proving exclusion in credit and lending shifts dramatically. Plaintiffs now have to show intent, not outcome. And here is the piece that matters. We are in an algorithmic underwriting environment. Discrimination inside a model does not leave a memo. It does not leave an email chain. It leaves a pattern of approvals and denials that only becomes visible in the aggregate. If you have studied fair lending historically, you already know that disparate impact is the tool that made structural discrimination legible. Without it, the pattern still exists, the visibility tightens. So, where does the scrutiny go now? Watch state attorneys general. Several of them retain their own fair lending authority and are unlikely to follow the federal retreat. Watch fair housing litigation because the private right of action does not disappear with the rule change. And watch how lenders calibrate their AI models when federal scrutiny loosens on the outcome side. When intent becomes the only standard, algorithms get more room to hide. Let's shift to Spirit Airlines. This week, Spirit entered advanced talks with the federal government for financing as it continues restructuring in bankruptcy. Coverage has positioned this as a corporate bailout story, and at the surface, it is. But the structural question is different. Think about what a low cost carrier actually does in the travel economy. It provides routes to regional airports, supports price competition on major corridors, and gives cost sensitive travelers access to destinations that would otherwise be out of reach. When a carrier like that becomes fragile, the effects are not confined to the balance sheet. They show up in regional tourism, airport revenue, fare floors across the industry, and mobility for working class travelers. If you work in travel, tourism, or destination economics, you have seen this dynamic before. Affordable mobility is rarely framed as public infrastructure until it is in danger of disappearing. Then the conversation changes quickly. So, what is the real question inside this deal? Watch the framing of the federal support because framing determines what comes next. Is it job protection? Is it fare stability? Is it market concentration? Is it consumer mobility? Each frame opens a different door. And watch whether this establishes a template for how the federal government treats distressed carriers going forward. When affordable mobility becomes fragile, market failure becomes public infrastructure. And finally, cannabis. The federal government moved this week to reclassify state licensed medical marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. This is a significant market signal, and the coverage has rightly emphasized the implications for banking, taxation, research, and licensed operators. But there is a structural gap inside this story that most of the coverage has not named. Sit with this for a moment. The market is being normalized. The record is not. Criminal convictions tied to cannabis, the post incarceration consequences that follow those convictions, and the collateral effects on housing, employment, licensing, and family law remain largely intact. Reclassification at the federal level does not expunge a record. It does not restore a professional license. It does not undo an immigration consequence. It does not return a child from foster care. If you work in criminal justice or reentry policy, you already know this pattern. Market reform tends to run ahead of record reform by years, sometimes decades. The people who paid the price of prohibition are rarely the ones who benefit first from legalization. So, who is the reform actually for? Watch banking access for licensed operators because capital movement is where normalization becomes real. Watch tax treatment under the new schedule. Watch state level record clearing policy, which is uneven and politically contested. And watch who is positioned to enter the expanded market, because that answer tells you where the benefit is landing and who is still waiting. When the market gets normalized before the record does, policy has unfinished business. So let's bring this together. 5 signals, 1 underlying shift. Here is what most people will miss if they read these stories separately. This week was not about a single sector. It was about conversion. A court ruling converted into cash flow. Workplace behavior converted into AI training data. Fair lending rules converted into algorithmic discretion, airline distress converted into a question of public mobility, cannabis reform converted into market normalization without record reform. Sit with that pattern for a moment. If you are reading this week only through the headlines, you are seeing five unrelated stories. If you are reading it structurally, you are seeing the same motion repeated across different systems. Policy, law, and institutional decisions are being converted into operational realities. And in each case, the conversion changes who bears the cost and who captures the benefit. That is the pattern worth carrying into next week. Today's instruction: track what became operational this week, not just what became visible. That is the brief for today. Good to be in the room with you. Until next time, this has been CR Change Request.